Jerusalem had no river, no harbor, no commanding trade route, no natural advantage that any military engineer in the ancient world would have chosen. Every empire that ever built a great city built it on water, on wealth, or on stone that gave armies a reason to stop marching. Jerusalem had none of those things. And yet, this limestone ridge in the Judean highlands became the most besieged, most contested, most mourned, and most longed for city in all of recorded history. Destroyed at least twice in its documented history, besieged more than 20 times, captured and recaptured by empires that no longer exist. But this is where historians, archaeologists, and researchers keep finding themselves drawn back to the same hill. Jerusalem's greatest turning points, its destruction, its exile, its return, seem to unfold along patterns already documented in Scripture before they happened. The empires that would conquer it, the length of the captivity, the foreign ruler who would bring the exile to an end and authorize the rebuilding, written down in advance by men who lived, worked, and worshipped on this very ridge. That is not a simple claim, and Jerusalem is not a simple city. This is that story. The first people who stopped on that ridge stopped because of water. A single spring, the Gihon, pushed up through a crack in the eastern slope of the hill. In this landscape of limestone and desert wind, that spring was everything. Grain could grow, animals could drink, people could survive the summer. By roughly 3000 BCE, a permanent settlement had formed around it. But the geography that looked like a weakness was, many researchers argue, actually something else entirely. Jerusalem sat near the center of the ancient world's three great land masses, Africa, Asia, and Europe, within a few days' travel of Egypt to the southwest, Mesopotamia to the northeast, and the Mediterranean coast to the west. The hill that seemed to be nowhere was, geographically, close to the junction of everywhere. And already from its earliest recorded days, something unusual was happening here. Genesis 14 records that Abraham met a figure at this location. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, "Blessed be Abram of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth." Genesis 14, 18 through 19. Salem, the ancient root of Jerusalem, and the first time this hill appears in Scripture, it is already priestly, already connected to worship of the Most High God, already marking this ground as something set apart from the territory around it. What would it take to convince you that a city had a purpose beyond politics? Hold that question, because this story is going to keep pressing it. At this point, nobody standing on that ridge could imagine what was coming. This hill would one day host the Ark of the Covenant, produce a temple that stunned the ancient world, survive a Babylonian siege, be named in Scripture by a foreign ruler not yet born, and hear a rabbi from Galilee predict its complete architectural destruction 40 years before it happened. Around 1000 BCE, a warrior king named David changed everything. The Jebusites held the city. They believed their walls made it impregnable. The Bible records their taunt that the blind and the lame could defend it against David. 2 Samuel 5:6. David took it anyway, and what came next mattered much more than the military victory. He brought the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. So they brought the Ark of the Lord and set it in his place in the midst of the tabernacle that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. 2 Samuel 6:17. In the ancient Near East, every civilization organized itself around a divine center, a ziggurat, a sacred mountain, a temple enclosure. The Ark was understood in Israel as the throne of God, the meeting point between the divine and the human. David moved the center here, to this ridge, to this hill that had no river and no harbor and no obvious reason to matter. From that moment, Jerusalem was not simply a capital, it was a theological claim about where heaven and earth met. Solomon completed the logic. On a limestone outcropping on the northern end of the ridge, the same rock that ancient Jewish tradition identifies as the place where Abraham bound Isaac, he built the temple. 7 years of construction, 10,000 workers at a time. Craftsmen were brought from Tyre, cedar from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, a location investigators of the ancient world continue to debate. Somewhere in Arabia or along the East African coast, weeks of travel by sea. The dedication of that temple produced one of the most striking scenes in the entire Hebrew Bible. And it came to pass, when the priests were come out of the holy place, that the cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud. For the glory of the Lord had filled the house of the Lord. The priests could not stand. But here is where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Even as the temple stood gleaming on that ridge, the prophets were writing. Not a celebration, warning, and something more precise than a warning. Specific timelines, specific nations. Isaiah, writing around 700 BCE, with the temple still standing and the sacrifices still burning, documented coming judgment. Jeremiah, writing roughly a century later, was even more exact. He named a specific nation, a specific duration. And this whole land shall be a desolation and an astonishment, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon 70 years. 70 years. Babylon. Written before the first Babylonian soldier had crossed into Judean territory. If you had heard those words recited outside the temple courts, surrounded by the sound of worship and the smell of sacrifice, would you have believed them? In 597 BCE, Nebuchadnezzar arrived at Jerusalem's walls. He came back in 586 BCE after a client king named Zedekiah rebelled. The siege lasted 18 months. The Book of Lamentations records the weight of those final days from inside the city. And in the summer of 586 BCE, Solomon's temple, which had stood for nearly 4 centuries, burned. The leading families of Judah were marched across the desert into Babylon. Scribes, priests, craftsmen, leaders, placed inside the most formidable city on earth at that time, beside the Euphrates, under the shadow of the Ishtar Gate, with its glazed blue tiles and gilded reliefs. And there, far from the hill they had built their entire civilization around, they did something no conqueror anticipated. They wrote it all down. Many investigators of the ancient world believed the Torah reached its definitive compiled form during this period of exile. The prophetic literature took final shape. The Psalms, those ancient songs of Jerusalem, of ascent, of longing, of lament, were preserved by careful hands that understood exactly what was being lost and exactly what had to survive it. Think about what that meant in practice. A people who had lost their land, their king, their temple, and their entire sacrificial system, encoding their civilization entirely into language, not just recording history, surviving inside it. One of the Psalms captures what that exile felt like from the inside.
By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. We hanged our harps upon the willows in the midst thereof. Psalm 137, 1-2. And then, Psalm 137, 5-6 says, If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. This is not ornamental poetry. This is a memory system, a way of encoding an entire civilization into language so it could not be burned. So that no matter how far the exile stretched, no matter how many generations passed beside the wrong river, under the wrong sky, Jerusalem would remain present and real and specific in every recitation. The Babylonians burned the city to end Jerusalem's story. What they produced instead was a Jerusalem that could never be destroyed again because it no longer lived only in stone. And then the story becomes genuinely difficult to explain. Isaiah had already named the man who would end the exile. He did not describe him in general terms, named him. That saith of Cyrus, He is my shepherd, and shall perform all my pleasure. Even saying to Jerusalem, Thou shalt be built, and to the temple, thy foundation shall be laid. Isaiah 44:28. Cyrus, written into the text by most scholarly reckonings roughly 150 years before Cyrus was born, the dating that scholars continue to debate, though the historical identification itself is well documented in the ancient record. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia conquered Babylon. Within his first year of rule, he issued a decree: displaced peoples could return to their homelands. The Cyrus cylinder, still preserved in the British Museum, records his policy in his own words. The Jewish exiles began the long journey home across the same desert their grandparents had crossed in chains. By 516 BCE, 70 years after the temple's destruction, precisely the duration Jeremiah had specified, a second temple stood on the same rock. For those who hold Scripture as revelation, the pattern carries obvious weight. For those who approach it historically, the questions become harder to set aside. Either way, Jerusalem continues to resist easy explanation. The Second Temple era produced the city's greatest architectural moment and its most devastating loss. Herod the Great, Rome's appointed king of Judea, undertook a construction project around 20 BCE that ancient writers described in terms approaching disbelief. He encased the natural Temple Mount Hill in massive retaining walls, individual stones that some archaeologists estimate at over 500 tons, fitted without mortar with a precision that still draws serious attention from modern engineers. The finished platform covered 36 acres. The temple itself, clad in white marble and gold, blazed in the Judean sun and was visible for miles.
Thousands walked those courts every day. Priests offered sacrifices at dawn. Pilgrims traveled for weeks from Egypt, from Mesopotamia, from across the Roman world to stand beneath those stones. The noise of merchants and money changers filled the outer porticos. The smell of incense and sacrifice drifted over the entire ridge. Nobody walking through those courts in the first century imagined they were looking at a structure with less than a generation left to stand. And then a rabbi from Galilee named Jesus walked out of that temple and turned to his disciples. Matthew 24:2 says, And Jesus said unto them, See ye not all these things? Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down.
stones.
not one stone
Wonderful
upon
buildings
another.
are these.
How would your understanding of history shift if the center of an entire civilization's worship disappeared within a single generation of that prediction? In 70 CE, roughly 40 years after those words were spoken, the Roman legions under Titus surrounded Jerusalem. After a 5-month siege, the city fell. The temple burned. And when the Romans dismantled the remaining structure to recover the gold that had melted into the stone joints during the fire, they did what no army had managed in centuries of attempts. They removed the stones one by one. The Arch of Titus in Rome, erected 11 years later, still stands. It depicts the looted temple menorah being carried through the streets in triumph. What the Romans had not calculated was the destruction would produce. Without a temple, the sacrifice system that had organized Jewish worship for 1,000 years was gone overnight. What emerged in its place was something more portable and, as history would demonstrate, more enduring. Prayer replaced sacrifice. The synagogue replaced the temple courts. And wherever Jewish communities scattered across the Roman world, across Egypt, across Asia Minor, across Europe, the direction of prayer always faced the same limestone hill. Every morning, every Passover, next year in Jerusalem. You cannot exile a city that an entire people carry inside them. Stand for a moment on the Mount of Olives, the same ridge where Jesus stood when he wept over the city before predicting its destruction. Below, the Kidron Valley traces the eastern edge of the Temple Mount. Directly across, the Golden Dome marks the platform where the temple stood. Archaeologists are still excavating. Beneath the Ottoman stones, Crusader rubble. Beneath that, Byzantine mosaic. Beneath that, Roman columns. Beneath that, Herodian ashlar. Beneath that, Babylonian destruction debris. Each layer a civilization that believed it had finally settled the question of this hill. None of them did. The Gihon spring still flows. Hezekiah's tunnel cut through 500 meters of solid limestone around 700 BCE, workers beginning from both ends and meeting in the middle with remarkable accuracy, still carries water today, cold and clear. The same spring that drew the first settlers to this ridge 3,000 years before the temple was built.
Rome is gone. Babylon is gone. Persia is gone. The empires that besieged this city, conquered it, renamed it, and in several cases attempted to erase it from official maps, gone. But every morning, somewhere in the world, people still face this direction, still read texts that were written on this hill, still say the words the Exile said beside the Euphrates 2,500 years ago. And the question that opened this story remains exactly where it started. Why here? Why this particular ridge with no river, no harbor, no strategic advantage that any ancient planner would have identified? Why Jerusalem? If that question stays with you, the story isn't finished. What part of this changed the way you see Scripture or the way you see history? I'd genuinely like to know. The spring still flows. The hill still stands. The texts are still being read. Empires rose and disappeared. Kings came and went. Armies marched across this ridge believing they had finally settled the question of Jerusalem. None of them did. Because at the heart of this city once stood a single room, built with extraordinary precision and set apart from every other space on earth. Generations believed it marked the meeting place between heaven and earth itself. It was designed for a purpose, and for nearly 2,000 years, it has remained empty. History remembers that fact. Scripture wrestles with it, and every generation must decide what to make of it.